Ricominciamo dunque i lavori della nostra settimana. La parola adesso a Martha BAYLESS dell'Università dell'Oregon e ricordo a tutti che qui sono i fogli per iscriversi alla discussione. Dopo la relazione di Martha BAYLESS apriremo dunque subito la discussione. No? E quindi prego le persone di iscriversi. Adesso, ringraziando molto della sua presenza Martha BAYLESS, le do la parola sul tema The Pleasure of the Ludic. Prego.
Good afternoon. I would like to start out with a joke. A priest is taking a walk through the woods when suddenly he comes across a hungry bear. The bear sees him and begins to chase him. The priest is terrified and begins to run, but then he remembers his faith. So he stops and falls to his knees, praying, "O Lord, turn this bear into a Christian." I'm going to stop before I get to the end of this joke. I'll finish this joke later, because this brings me to my first point. Of all the forms of game and play, a joke is the one most focused on a certain moment, a payoff, the punchline. And yet, even in this form, the ludic does not just begin at the punchline. The pleasure, the anticipation, begins as soon as you get the signal that you are in the world of play. This was brought home to me the other day when I saw a man on television talking about how much his father enjoyed the comic films of Laurel and Hardy. The man said he didn't even wait for the first joke. He'd started laughing as soon as the film began. So one of my arguments in this paper is that the pleasures of the ludic start with the idea of the ludic. And I will define the ludic as the playful, the lighthearted, the fun, the humorous, the non-serious. As soon as an audience hears, "Once an old man decided to marry a young and lively woman," or the pieces are laid out on the board game, or the musicians pick up their instruments, the world of the ludic has been set in motion. I have characterized the ludic elsewhere as a kind of pocket carnival or portable utopia, a world where the rules are different and more fun. It is a parallel mini-world where the things of the real world matter enough to make it interesting, but not enough to make it horrifying. In this paper, I want to consider two questions. The first is why we turn to the ludic. What is our motivation? What promises does it hold for us? When we hear an old man decided to marry a young wife, or the game pieces are set out on the board, what are we hoping for? For instance, are we anticipating an emotional experience, or a cognitive experience, or some combination of the two? What kind of drive urges us toward the ludic? To ask it another way, what kinds of pleasures does the ludic provide? If we answer amusement, what does that really mean? Scholarship has some stock answers to these questions along the lines of comic relief, but I hope to provide some additional food for thought along less familiar lines. The second question is, what is it about the ludic that provides these pleasures? I hope here to draw your attention to some common structural features shared by different varieties of the ludic, and to think about the commonalities in light of the previous question. First of all, let me sketch in some of the manifestations of the ludic so that we may have a more concrete idea of the area of inquiry. Perhaps the area of the ludic that has the greatest scholarly stature is the carnivalesque, or in fact, literally carnivals, times of celebration, drinking, feasting, abundance, dancing, and riotous behavior generally. As the 10th century English King Edgar complained about the carnivalesque behavior of clerics, interestingly enough, there gaming takes place, there dancing and singing, there people are awake until the middle of the night with loud noise and uncouth behavior. The individual components of our ludic, of course, particularly drinking, which adds a ludic aspect to nearly any activity it accompanies. Thus, some of our categories overlap with others. This is also true of singing, which may involve drinking, the pleasures of music, the pleasures of doing something in unison, and I will say more about this later, and depending on the song, the pleasures of narrative and/or of humor. Singing appears to have accompanied dancing more frequently than it does today, and we must also include dancing in the roster. Dancing was apparently sometimes single-sex. Women are often described dancing in a group, in which case watching the dancing was an involving spectator sport for the men, forming an early instance of what's become known as the male gaze. Dancing could also include both genders and was often conducted holding hands, allowing for bodily contact, which certainly fostered hopes for other bodily pleasures. Thus, it is not surprising that in addition to the passage I quoted above, King Edgar complained that the wayward clerics expend themselves in feasting and drinking sessions, in beds and acts of shamelessness, so that now the houses of the clerics are considered brothels of prostitutes, gathering places for performers. The fact that he was condemning these activities shows that he regarded them as incompatible with strict religion. So we might well describe the ludic as free from religious constraint. Dancing might be focused on things other than flirtation, however. Such are the warrior dances that seem to have been current in the early Middle Ages, in which instead of holding hands, men brandish weapons at each other in a form of mock war that perhaps bears as much conceptual resemblance to board games as it does to other types of dance. And the ludic, of course, includes games, both board games, which, as I am sure this group of scholars, above all, is aware of, had a serious importance in the early Middle Ages, and more physical types of games, such as ball games, martial games, games on horseback, and games that might be characterized as roughhousing. And our final category of the ludic is verbal play, including lighthearted storytelling and humor, jokes, comic stories, and comic songs. And I realize that I've left the hunting out of the ludic, which the previous speakers have reminded me, so let's add hunting in. In discussing what pleasures are provided by the ludic, we should talk about what I will call primary and secondary pleasures, or more precisely, the pleasures of the ludic versus the benefits of the ludic. Let's take a few examples of the ludic from the 15th century French De Monde Joyeuse, a collection of comic riddles. Here's one. Why do dogs go so eagerly to church? Because they see the cloth laid on the altar and they think it's time for dinner. Or, how many calves' tails does it take to reach from the earth to the sky? And the answer is no more than one if it's long enough. Or, what thing is it that hath no end? And the answer is a bowl. Now, admittedly, these are not the cleverest jokes ever told, but they demonstrate classic joke structure. They start with a beginning that sets the tone on a high level, for instance, what thing is it that has no end, for which we might expect a serious medieval answer to be something like God's mercy or the pains of hell. And then the joke takes a sudden descent into the domestic and everyday, an example of comic deflation, while conforming to the requirements of the initial setup. So this conforms to the classic two-stage cognitive theory of humor: incongruity and resolution, with the first stage being the incongruity of the answer, and the second stage the resolution, when it becomes clear how the answer fits the question. There is a massive literature on how exactly this all works, on whether it should be considered incongruity or ambiguity, and many other questions, but the point is that this mismatch between the beginning and the end produces an irreducible cognitive pleasure. In the case of the riddles I just mentioned, it may not be a very large pleasure, but it is easily identified as playful. Other kinds of play produce different kinds of pleasures. And I want to spend a moment talking about those less obvious kinds of pleasures. The first of these is community. Play fosters interaction, and many of the types of play I mentioned would be pointless without interaction, among them carnival, board games, ball games and other games, riddles, and humor. In the modern day, some of these amusements are available in what we call pseudo-social situations. We can read a story from a book or play a game online, amusements that were wholly or effectively unavailable in the early Middle Ages. The availability of recorded music means modern people may also dance alone, but I venture to say in far fewer numbers than with others and with less enthusiasm. And the phenomenon of laughter suggests how much sociability improves our experience of humor. Laughter is social by nature. Nobody makes a joke when they're alone. Modern studies find that a person is also less likely to laugh out loud when reading or watching something alone, even if the material is ranked equally funny with humor experienced in a group. According to one finding, people are 30 times more likely to laugh in company than when alone. And a person who does laugh alone is most likely enjoying a pseudo-social situation, such as watching a television comedy. This is, in fact, why producers put laugh tracks on comedy television shows, to fool the brain into thinking it is in a social situation. The laugh track also plays into the fact that laughter is socially contagious. Experiments with a laughter box, a box that produces laughing sounds, finds that the sound of laughter alone is enough to trigger laughter in most listeners. Humor has been identified as having broaden and build effects. It fosters more creative problem solving, cements social relationships, rewards cooperation, and enhances social cohesion. In short, it is meant to be experienced in groups of 2 or more, and it usually is. It needs other people. And its benefit is that it finds them and creates a shared experience of delight with them. The communality of play is certainly true even today in our atomized world, and was certainly even truer in the early Middle Ages. With fewer solitary pastimes available, amusements were necessarily social, from games to feasting and dancing. The amusement with the most dramatic difference from modern practice is that of literature or verbal play, which is almost exclusively oral and communal. I have worked extensively on medieval Latin parodies, a genre which might be thought to be exclusive and primarily written in form, if any were. They are certainly preserved in manuscript, and the fact that they were composed in Latin makes them an unusually elite form of amusement. However, almost without exception, they take the form of an oral genre, a reading from the Mass, or a parody of the Mass itself, or of a saint's life, or of grammars in the form of dialogues. Even this most esoteric of genres was clearly composed for performance and hence for community. Another effect produced by successful play is what the psychologist Csikszentmihalyi has termed flow, a rewarding experience of great absorption. According to him, flow is characterized by 6 features: the intense and focused concentration on the present moment, a merging of action and awareness, a loss of reflective self-consciousness, a sense of personal control or agency over the situation or activity, a distortion of temporal experience, one's subjective experience of time is altered, and the experience of the activity is intrinsically rewarding, what's called Autotelic Experience. And I should confess that I copied this straight off of Wikipedia. Flow is clearly a close cousin of play. One might almost say that flow happens when an activity takes on the experience of play. Although flow has been studied as a dimension of performing a task, it is closely allied to the degree of pleasurable absorption, almost a trance state, experienced while engaged in something like reading an absorbing book, or in the early Middle Ages, hearing a well-told story. This brings to mind the author John Gardner's description of fiction, that it should be a vivid and continuous dream. A goal-oriented task, such as playing a game, may readily produce flow, but is also a result of other kinds of activities. The effect of engaging in these may be characterized as flow, but it can also be described as an experience or perhaps an emotion that almost does not have a name, the pleasurable or gratifying experience of being absorbed into something larger than oneself. The social psychologist Jonathan Haidt has identified this as one of the benefits potentially bestowed by religion, although it is not restricted to religion, of course. The same emotion might also be experienced in, for example, being one of a crowd of fervent fans at a football game. Haidt has studied one dimension of this emotion, which he terms elevation, an emotional response to moral beauty related to awe and wonder, and which may inspire people to act altruistically. The emotion I am talking about is related to elevation in that it has an aspect of awe, but unlike Haidt's elevation, it has no particular moral dimension. It is more a pleasurable eclipse of the self. In the modern world, it might be experienced while listening to loud music at a nightclub or concert. The normal boundaries of the self are effaced by the loudness of the music, the darkness, the experience of moving in time with rhythm, and the numbers of people not fully distinguishable in the darkness, all engaged in the same motions. But these conditions don't have to be enforced as such for dance to confer this feeling. The music serves as an outside force that aligns the dancer with it, and in fact the right music has a pleasantly overwhelming effect without which the experience would be lackluster. As Maurice de Saxe, the Marshal of France, noted as early as the 18th century, "Everyone has seen people dancing all night, but take a man and make him dance for a quarter of an hour without music and see if he can bear it." The music takes the dancer outside of herself. In early medieval dance, the feeling might be produced by holding hands, a contact with others which marks the activity as exceptional, by moving in time to the music, and by the experience of a group of people all doing the same actions simultaneously, so that in a way the self and others are in a sense confused. Some very preliminary studies have been done on this kind of activity and the response it may produce in mirror neurons, the nerve cells that fire both when one performs an action and when one sees someone else performing the same action. Indeed, it was the neuroscientist V.S. Ramachandran who discovered that the pains and itching of phantom limbs could be alleviated by arranging mirrors so that other people's limbs would appear to the brain to be the body's own limbs, which could then be scratched or unclenched. In other words, the brain can use the parallel actions of others to extend itself, thereby, in the case of activities such as dancing, invoking the pleasure of the subsumed self. This also holds true for war dances. Such movement was the subject of W.H. McNeill's 1995 study, Keeping Together in Time, Dance and Drill in Human History. McNeill writes of movement in unison, "The emotion it arouses constitutes an infinitely expansible basis for social cohesion among any and every group that keeps together in time, moving big muscles together and chanting, singing, or shouting rhythmically. Muscular bonding is the most economical label I could find for this phenomenon, and I hope the phrase will be understood to mean the euphoric fellow feeling that prolonged and rhythmic muscular movement arouses among nearly all participants in such exercises." McNeill argues that these practices result in valuable social cohesion, and he terms the subsumption into a larger whole boundary loss. And there's some dancing maidens exhibiting boundary loss. So sociability and community, flow, and loss of self or boundary loss are some of the less examined pleasures of the ludic. The ludic may also produce other pleasurable responses of the kind that have been widely discussed. The theory that humor operates by conferring a feeling of superiority has a long history, stretching back to Plato and Aristotle and elaborated by Freud. That superiority may operate in the ludic is even clearer when we look at competitive games. That each person or team seeks to win is clear even in ball games or games such as kickboot. Kickboot, medieval game where you kick each other's boots and try to knock each other over, which do not mimic any more serious activity. The competitive aspect is even more forceful in games that imitate war, such as the melee or tournament, or board games such as Tafel or chess. We may be reminded, for instance, of the story about King Canute. When Canute lost a game, or saw that he was on the eve of doing so, he very commonly took up the huge chessboard on which he played and broke it on the head of his opponent. He was on one occasion playing with his brother-in-law, the Earl Ulf, when the Earl, seeing that he had a forced mate and knowing the king's weakness for knocking out the brains of successful antagonists, quietly left the table. Canute, who guessed his motive, shouted after him, "Do you run away, you coward?" To which the other, who had lately rescued the king in an unfortunate engagement with the Swedes, replied, "You would have been glad to run faster at the Helga when I saved you from the Swedes who were cudgeling you." Canute subsequently has Ulf murdered. This is only one high-profile example of the kind of violence that broke out after chess games on a considerable number of occasions, recorded in historical as much as in literary sources. Superiority theory might seem to contradict the type of ludic which fosters boundary loss, but it is possible to reconcile the two. In each, competition with others is eased, either by a clear victory or by regarding others as indistinct from oneself. Thus, the tension of status competition is effaced for a brief time. Another of the contending theories of humor is relief theory. either that humor provides psychological relief against constraint, again as championed by Freud, or against social constraint, a view that finds voice in the early Middle Ages, in the whole Middle Ages, and is particularly associated with Mikhail Bakhtin and his theories of the carnivalesque. We might note that this is also compatible with superiority theory or with boundary loss theory. The experience of no longer having to assert the self may provide relief. The very fact that play is autotelic, that it provides its own satisfaction, means that it is relieved of having to matter to the outside world. So, for instance, with board games, it is all the fun of war with none of the actual risk. This leads us to the question of the kind of meaning that play has. It is defined as not useful, but paradoxically, it is useful to have something that is not useful in our lives. Does play, then, serve a larger end? It has been argued that play ultimately serves the status quo, enacting as a safety valve that relieves pressure that otherwise might build up against oppression, or conversely, that it acts as a subversive element, undermining the serious elements of society. And because this question is an important one for the study of culture, it has come to have a prominent place in scholarship and to elevate the carnivalesque and the ludic into objects of serious study. The ultimate answer for this particular question of whether the carnivalesque is subversive or serves the status quo seems to be that sometimes it does the one, sometimes the other. Both can be important functions. Moreover, these are not merely functions relating to the relationship between authority and the powerless. The ludic plays with the most valent aspects of culture, with military power, in the case of warlike games and war dances, with sex, in the case of body stories and songs, and with activities like dancing, with the relationship between the genders, again in the case of stories, songs, and dancing, and in many physical games, and with religion, in verbal play, masquerades, and similar merrymaking. These elements have perhaps been the most studied aspects of medieval storytelling. Through these, what is by definition unserious gathers meaning. As John D. Niles has written, cultural activities that are keenly expressive of the underlying spirit of an era have commonly been viewed as mere entertainment, and is paradoxically this ludic quality that enables them to bear effortlessly a heavy cargo of meaning. The ludic acquires an extra charge, both of relevance and of gratifying transgression, by incorporating cultural stresses into its unfolding. A game is no longer merely a game. A joke is no longer merely a joke. Both can smuggle deeper cultural work into the event by virtue of their lightheartedness. This is why politicians fear mockery and why satirists have always been considered dangerous people. The act of merely taking something not seriously can be subversive, and comic tales and songs typically show the powerless taking power, the young triumphing over the old, women hoodwinking men, peasants outfoxing the powerful, the celibate enjoying the fruits of seduction, and oppressive clerics exposed as hypocrites. The ludic lays bare the structures of power, and handily enough, the structures of power are just what modern scholarship finds important and compelling. So I think it is no accident that those forms that lay bare the structures of power, such as the fabliau and carnivalesque rioting, have had a great deal of scholarship devoted to them. Those forms that modern scholarship cannot quite grasp onto have received very little attention. For instance, my special interest, the board game Tafel, which is a supremely popular and important cultural activity in Northern Europe for perhaps 600 years. It was so important culturally that, as you may recall, in Old Norse legend, as recounted in the Elder Edda, the Aesir, the supernatural beings, played Tafel at the beginning of the world, and after the destruction of the world and the recreation of a new world, the Tafel pieces will again be found in the grass. Thus, the game is obviously culturally important, and yet it is hard for modern scholarship to know what to do with this kind of importance. Thus, we have three aspects of the ludic: the pleasurable emotions which they evoke, the cultural effects that they have on power and the things of the serious world, and the ways they were embedded into the culture's larger understanding of the world. The question I want to address is which of these is the primary function of the ludic. More specifically, I want to argue that our drive toward the ludic is very basic, the drive towards pleasurable emotions, and the other functions are layered on top of that primary drive. This is not the impression one might gather from a good deal of the scholarship on play, which tends to imply or assert that the main goal of the ludic is to subvert the dominant paradigm, that humor and amusement are a side effect of the effort, or merely present to assist in the effort. Yet I might point out that when we go to see entertainers, we feel that they fail if they are not amusing to watch, rather than if their performance is not subversive enough. When we hear a joke, it falls flat if the punchline doesn't cause a laugh, whereas a joke that's funny but fails to undermine the power structure is still considered a success. In fact, it is the first duty of any performance of the ludic not to be dull. Everything else is secondary. So to refer back to the riddles from the Demons Joyeux, which I quoted earlier, the one about why do dogs go in the church so that they think the altars are being laid for dinner. This could serve as fruitful ground for interpretation. A literary scholar might point out the contrast between the holy clerics preparing the altar for Mass and the ludicrous and bestial dogs, maybe to be interpreted as lay folk, who come in, perhaps interpreting the Eucharist as mere earthly foodstuff. Or we could understand the joke as a critique of the church, which keeps its riches for itself and insists on regarding the hungry at its doors as mere animals, a conflict between the masters and the lowly. An allegorical interpretation practically begs to be written, and yet the joke is not that good. It is only weakly amusing, despite the wealth of possible meaning, and thus it is not a great joke. The joke about the calf's tail, how many calf's tails does it take to reach the sky? One if it's long enough, is better, in my opinion, because it entraps the listener into thinking that a calf's tail has to be a certain reasonable length, and it also uses that nice medieval method of defining measurements by reference to everyday items, such as feet, arms, thumbs, how long it takes to do this or that, and plays on the actual ambiguity of that. I think it would seem funnier to us now if it were not of a type very familiar from the kind of joke we hear as children. A similar one, which is less familiar, may have more of its original effect. How deep is the sea? A stone's throw. I think that is actually quite clever. It has a satisfaction to it, a kind of logical neatness, which has nothing to do with subversion, power relations, or even much of the sources of cultural meaning. Play may have things of cultural weight, such as violence, sex, and religion, added into the mix to increase their impact, but their impact is more elemental than these things alone can explain. So to round off this investigation, I want to define the relationship between the ludic and meaning, because even if meaning is not the primary goal, the ludic derives part of its pleasure from its participation in meaning. Many forms of the ludic operate in a play world, a world in which things are deliberately and pleasantly free of impact, free of seriousness. Yet this world is aligned with the real serious world. The ludic offers a parallel reality, not an independent reality. This is strikingly apparent in the case of board games, which enacted either a race in games like Alia or Tabula, or even more potently, war in games like Tafel or chess. In such games, the playing pieces are known by names such as men, or in the Roman and post-Roman game of Latrunculi, little soldiers, the original meaning of Latrunculi. The key piece in the center of Tafel was known in Old English as the Kinningstone, the King's Stone. The early modern Welsh description of the game describes it in martial terms. It says, the above game, Talbwrdd or Tafel, should be played with a king in the center and 12 men in the places next to him, and 24 men seek to capture him. As war games are still described in such terms, these and similar pieces of evidence may seem unremarkable to modern ears. But the parallel world could take other forms, as in the description of the game of Alia in the Etymologiae of Isidore of Seville. Isidore aligns the game with war, in writing that the game itself was a product of war, invented during the slow periods of the Trojan War. And he also understands the game in allegorical terms, and you can see his long allegory of Alia there. A similar allegorical scheme is evident in a Middle Irish poem, in which the poet addresses a king by describing his kingdom as another board game. So the landscape with the king in it is like the board game with the king in it. In another instance, using the board game Fifth Kill, an Irish poet writes in an address to the Virgin Mary, "Your Son is King of the heavens, his the brightly clothed sun, his the gleaming moon. He owns the extent that he marks out of the seven heavens about the kingly seat. It is his hand that has strewn in them the fifth board of beautiful stars." Here the board game is mapped onto the cosmos. Throughout the Middle Ages, the players of these board games seem to have had an unquenchable desire to align them with the larger world, to take what is essentially almost a mathematical puzzle and to see it as a miniature way of enacting the larger and more serious universe. Another realm in which this parallelism is strikingly apparent is that of parody, such as the numerous drinkers' masses in which the devoted go not to the tabernacula, but to the tavernacula, and in their prayers not with per omnia secula seculorum, world without end, but with per omnia pocula populorum, cups without end, where they offer different versions of the Bible. There's a satire of the Pope and avarice. So these are obviously parallel worlds. Nearly as obvious will be the parallel worlds of the fabliau and of comic narrative, in which the real serious world is merely made more limited and less consequential, with its focus on the small victories of life. But what kind of parallel worlds are represented by activities such as dance? I would argue that dance is another type of realignment, an alignment with other people in a way that emphasizes cooperation and common interests, that lessens the threat in the world. The ludic as a whole is really this realignment, one step over from the serious, dangerous world, but made thrilling rather than menacing. Its alignment with the real world gives it meaning, but its removal from the real world gives it delight. In dance, people align with the music and, most importantly, with each other. And this is what the ludic does. It borrows the things of the serious world and reconfigures them. It realigns us towards absorption into a more pleasurable world, into community and flow, into delight. So finally, this brings us to the priest and the bear. As you will remember, the priest is walking in the woods when he comes across a hungry bear who comes after him in a rush. So the priest drops to his knees and prays, "O Lord, make this bear a Christian." And lo and behold, the bear catches up to the priest, drops to his own knees, and prays, "Lord, for what I am about to eat, may I be truly thankful." I hope that this story has illustrated to some small extent the pleasures of entering the ludic world, as well as the pleasure of being kept in suspense. And for a world in which man-eating bears are entertaining rather than threatening, may we be truly thankful. Thank you for your attention.